What if the most important word in the entire Bible, the word that could change everything you believe about faith, salvation, and who Jesus really is, was hiding in plain sight for 2,000 years? And what if one elderly man alone in a church library accidentally stumbled onto it on a Tuesday afternoon? Michael Anderson had read the Bible for 43 years. 43 years of Sunday mornings. 43 years of worn pages and ink-stained margins. 43 years of teaching teenagers, young couples, and grieving widows how to find comfort in Scripture. He thought he knew the Gospel of John. He was wrong. It started with a headache, not a dramatic headache, not the kind that drops you to your knees. Just that dull, tired ache behind the eyes that comes when you've been staring at small print for too long. Michael pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose and leaned back in the creaking wooden chair that had held his weight every Tuesday afternoon for 11 years. The church library at First Baptist of Charleston was not impressive. 3 walls of bookshelves that smelled like old paper and dust. A single lamp that flickered if you bumped the desk wrong. A window that looked out onto a parking lot, not a garden, not a river, just a parking lot, where Pastor Greg's 2003 Honda sat, collecting pine needles. Michael liked it that way. He didn't need beautiful surroundings to meet with God. He just needed quiet. He looked down at the page in front of him. John chapter 1. Verse 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He had read that sentence probably 800 times in his life. He could say it in his sleep. He had printed it on refrigerator magnets for vacation Bible school. He had cross-stitched it onto a pillow that now sat on his wife Dorothy's reading chair. But tonight, something stopped him. He read it again. In the beginning was the Word. He sat forward. Something was wrong. Not wrong in a scary way. Wrong in the way a puzzle piece feels when you've been forcing it into the wrong slot your whole life, and suddenly you turn it just slightly and feel it click. He opened his Greek concordance, the old one. The one his seminary professor had given him in 1981, with the inscription, "Michael, the text always has more to say. Keep listening." He found the Greek word for word, logos. His finger traced the column, logos, the divine reason, the rational principle that governs and develops the universe, the cosmic mind behind creation itself. Michael set the book down. His hands were trembling slightly, not from fear, from something else, from that feeling you get when you realize that the thing you've been looking at your whole life has a depth you never measured. He started writing in his journal, fast, the way he used to write in college when a thought came so quickly he couldn't get it down fast enough. John didn't start with Bethlehem. Why Matthew started there. Luke started there. Mark jumped straight into the ministry, but John backed up. He backed up all the way to before the first sunrise, before the first star, before anything existed at all. Why, he underlined the question 3 times. Then he turned the page. And that is when the real discovery began. He started counting. It was a strange impulse, the kind he couldn't explain even to Dorothy later that night, when she brought him a cup of chamomile tea and asked why he looked like he'd seen a ghost. He just started counting one particular word as it appeared through all 21 chapters of John's Gospel. The word was believe. Chapter 1, Chapter 2, Chapter 3. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. Chapter 4, Chapter 5, Chapter 6. Do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. Chapter 7, Chapter 8, Chapter 9. He was on his third sheet of paper now. Tally marks. He felt slightly ridiculous, like a man counting ceiling tiles in a hospital waiting room just to keep his mind occupied. But he kept going. By the time he reached Chapter 21, his hand stopped. He looked at the total. 98. He read it again. 98 times. John used the word believe 98 times in a single gospel. Michael sat back. That's not an accident, he said out loud to no one. His voice sounded strange in the empty library, a little hoarse, a little amazed. He picked up Matthew's gospel. He found a concordance count. The word believe appeared far fewer times. Mark even fewer. Luke, same pattern. But John 98. As if the man was not writing a biography, as if John was writing a courtroom argument, as if he was presenting evidence, stacking testimony upon testimony, sign upon sign, all driving toward a single verdict that every reader had to reach for themselves. Michael wrote in his journal, "John isn't telling you what to think. He's building a case and putting you in the jury box." Then he paused. His pen stopped moving, because he had just realized something even more startling. So I see. He pulled out a second concordance, then a third. He wanted to be sure. He cross-referenced the Greek. The word John used every single one of those 98 times was pisteuo, a verb, an action word. And here is where Michael's hands started trembling again, because he searched for the noun, the Greek noun that would mean faith, the word pistis, the static possessive form, the form that would mean faith as something you own, something you have, something you could display on a shelf like a trophy. He searched Chapter 1, Chapter 2, Chapter 3, all the way through, not once, not a single time. John never used the noun form of faith, not once in 21 chapters. Michael whispered under his breath. He did it on purpose. He leaned over the desk, pressing his palms flat against the wood, steadying himself. Because this changes everything about how you read John. If faith is a noun, if it's a thing you possess, then you can say, "I have faith," the same way you say, "I have a driver's license," and put it in a drawer and forget about it. But John wasn't interested in what you have. John was interested in what you do. Pisteuo, believe, as in right now, as in a continuous action, as in the kind of trust that doesn't sit still, the kind that moves your feet, the kind that changes the direction of your life. Michael closed his eyes. He thought about all the people he had watched walk in and out of church his whole life. Good people, decent people, people who owned Bibles with their names engraved on the cover, people who could tell you the 4 spiritual laws and the sinner's prayer and every word of amazing grace. And he wondered how many of them were believing actively, dynamically, daily, trusting their entire lives to Jesus, and how many were simply owning something. How many had turned the Gospel of John into a certificate instead of a calling? His phone buzzed on the desk. Dorothy. "Dinner's getting cold, sweetheart." He didn't move. He turned back to the first chapter. In the beginning was the Word. He said it slowly. Then he said it differently. In the beginning was the living action of God. In the beginning was the eternal movement of divine reason. In the beginning was the one who would not stay still. And something cracked open inside Michael Anderson that had been sealed for 43 years. Because John wasn't writing a quiet, contemplative gospel. John was writing the most urgent document in human history. John was the last surviving apostle. Matthew was gone. Peter was gone. Paul was gone. James was gone. They had all been killed or buried, and the early churches were scattered and frightened and full of questions. Who is Jesus really? Not the version you've heard, not the simplified version, not the stained glass version. Who is he really? And John, old John, the disciple who had leaned against Jesus at the Last Supper, the only apostle who stood at the foot of the cross and didn't run, John picked up a pen. And he wrote a gospel designed not simply to inform you, but to transform you. He wrote a gospel that would build a case so carefully, so methodically, so powerfully, that by the time you reached the end, you would not be able to walk away neutral. You would have to make a choice. Michael Anderson understood that in a way he never had before. He picked up his pen. At the top of a clean page, he wrote 3 words. He knew me. Not he knows facts, not he has information, not he owns a belief. He knew me. Present tense, active, living, moving. He circled it. Then he flipped back to John chapter 1 and started reading again. This time, he was not reading the way you read something familiar. He was reading the way you read a letter that was written to you personally by someone who loved you across 2,000 years of silence. And for the first time in 43 years of reading, the Gospel of John, Michael Anderson felt like he was meeting it for the very first time. Michael drove home that night with his journal on the passenger seat and his mind running faster than his headlights could reach. Dorothy was already asleep when he got in. He didn't wake her. He sat at the kitchen table with a cold plate of roast chicken and green beans, and he didn't eat a single bite. He just stared at his notes, at those tally marks, at 98, at the word pistewo circled in red pen 3 different times. He kept asking himself the same question that John had planted in him like a splinter he couldn't reach. If John used believe as a verb as an action, then what were the miracles for? Because here was the thing that bothered Michael the most. He had taught the miracles of John's gospel for decades. He had preached the wedding at Cana to 4 different youth groups. He had walked through the feeding of the 5,000 at a men's breakfast where someone brought donuts and someone else made a joke about loaves and fishes, and everyone laughed. He had read about Lazarus at 3 funerals, one of which was for his own father. He thought he understood what the miracles were. He was wrong about that too. The next Tuesday, Michael was back in that chair before the sun had fully cleared the tree line outside the parking lot window. He had barely slept. Not from anxiety, from the electric, restless feeling of being on the edge of something. The feeling a man gets when he knows the next page is going to change the story. He opened to John chapter 2. Cana, the wedding, the water into wine. He read it the way he had trained himself to read it after the night before, slowly like a man examining a diamond for the first time and realizing it has more facets than he counted. John's description was deliberate, almost strange in its restraint. No thunder, no crowd gasping in slow motion, just a quiet instruction. Stone jars, water, a servant who poured without understanding why. And then the master of the feast tasting something extraordinary and turning to the groom with genuine confusion on his face, asking why he had saved the best wine for last. And then John wrote something that stopped Michael cold. What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Michael read that sentence 4 times. He reached for his pen, because John did not call it a miracle. John called it a sign. He wrote the word in his journal and underlined it. Then he wrote the Greek beside it. Semeion, sign, signal. A marker that points somewhere else. Something that by definition is never the main thing, because its entire purpose is to direct your attention beyond itself. Michael sat up straight. "He's not collecting miracle stories," he said quietly to the empty room. "He's building a trail. 7 signs. He counted them. Water into wine, healing the official's son. The paralyzed man at the pool, feeding 5,000 people. Walking on water, giving sight to the blind man, raising Lazarus from the dead. 7 signs. And Michael noticed something that made his breath catch. They escalate, each one bigger than the last, each one pushing the boundaries of what a human being could explain away. You could maybe argue that the wine was already there and someone missed it. You could stretch your logic and suggest the official's son recovered on his own. You might even, with enough desperation, find a natural explanation for the feeding of the crowds. But Lazarus 4 days dead, wrapped in burial cloths, already in the ground. No one explains away Lazarus. John knew exactly what he was doing. He was turning up the volume sign by sign until the evidence was so overwhelming that the only honest response was a verdict. Michael wrote in the margin of his journal, "John didn't give people room to stay comfortable on the fence." But then he turned the page, and that's when the story took a turn he hadn't expected. John chapter 6, the feeding of the 5,000. The day after the miracle, the crowd followed Jesus across the lake. They were excited. They were energized. They had seen bread multiply in someone's hands. They had eaten until they were full from almost nothing. This was extraordinary. This was the kind of thing you told your grandchildren about. And Jesus looked at them and said something that stopped the celebration cold. "You are looking for me, not because you saw the signs, but because you ate the loaves and had your fill." Michael stared at that sentence. He read it again. Jesus wasn't congratulating them for following. He was confronting them. He was saying you came back for the bread, not for what the bread meant, not for the one who gave it. You came back because your stomach was full and you wanted to be full again. And then Jesus said something even harder. "Do not work for food that spoils, but for food that endures to eternal life." The crowd liked that. They asked the right next question. What must we do to do the works God requires? And Jesus answered, "The work of God is this, to believe in the one he has sent." Michael's pen hit the page hard. There it was again. Believe, not understand, not admire, not follow from a safe distance and see what happens. Believe. Pisteuo. Trust him with the weight of your entire life. And the crowd didn't like that answer, because believing was harder than being fed. This is where Michael stopped and did something he hadn't done in years. He put his face in his hands, not because he was sad, because he was convicted. He thought about his own faith, 43 years of it. He thought about the Tuesday afternoons and the Sunday mornings and the Bible studies and the margin notes. He thought about how comfortable he had become in his knowledge of this book, and he asked himself, quietly and honestly, the question that John had been building toward this whole time. When is the last time believing in Jesus actually cost you something? He sat with that question for a long time. Then he opened his journal and wrote, "Signs without surrender are just entertainment," because that is what John was revealing in chapter 6. The crowd had witnessed something extraordinary. They had seen a sign that pointed directly at the identity of Jesus, and their response was to make him their bread supplier, their miracle vending machine, their solution to physical hunger on a Tuesday afternoon by the lake. They had watched the sign, but they had refused to look where it pointed. And John recorded what happened next without softening it, without making it easier to read. Many of the disciples, not the Pharisees, not the religious leaders, not the enemies of Jesus, many of his own followers turned and walked away. And Jesus turned to the 12. He didn't chase the crowd. He didn't lower the standard to keep the numbers up. He looked at his closest friends and asked one of the most heartbreaking questions in Scripture. "You do not want to leave, too, do you?" Michael read Peter's answer slowly. "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. We have come to believe and to know that you are the Holy One of God." Michael had to stop. He pressed his thumb against the page against Peter's words as if he could feel the texture of the moment through 2,000 years of paper and ink. Because Peter didn't answer the question with a theological argument. He didn't list credentials or recite doctrine. He answered the way a man answers when he's standing at the edge of everything he knows, and there is only one direction left that makes any sense. Where else would we go? That is not the answer of someone who owns a belief. That is the answer of someone who is actively, desperately, completely believing. Michael leaned back. His coffee was cold. He hadn't touched it. The parking lot outside was filling up now, cars arriving for the Wednesday morning women's Bible study, and he could hear voices in the hallway. Laughter, the sound of someone dropping a key ring, a familiar chorus of good mornings, normal life, moving normally, right outside that door. And in here, Michael was sitting with a gospel that was anything but normal. He turned to John, chapter 9. The blind man. He had always read this story as a healing story. A man blind from birth. Jesus making mud, pressing it on the man's eyes, telling him to go wash. Sight restored. A beautiful miracle for a Tuesday morning devotional. But now he read it the way John intended. The Pharisees pulled the healed man in for questioning. They interrogated his parents. They demanded explanations. They were furious not because a man had suffered, but because Jesus had healed him on the Sabbath. And that broke their system, and systems are more comfortable than miracles when miracles start demanding things from you. And the blind man, this ordinary man who had never studied theology, never been to seminary, never read a concordance, said something that silenced the room. Whether he is a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know. I was blind, but now I see. Michael read that line out loud. His voice cracked on the last word. Because that man wasn't offering a dissertation. He wasn't defending a position. He was reporting the most personal, undeniable truth he had ever experienced. And the Pharisees threw him out. They rejected the evidence because the evidence didn't fit the conclusion they had already chosen. But then, and this is the moment Michael circled 3 times and wrote, "Look," beside it in the margin. Jesus heard that they had thrown the man out, and Jesus went and found him. Not the other way around. Jesus found him. "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" Jesus asked. And the man who had been blind said, "Lord, I believe." 3 words. The shortest, most complete sentence in the entire Gospel of John. Michael closed the journal. He pressed both hands flat on the cover and stayed still, because he understood now what John was doing with every single one of these 7 signs. He wasn't collecting impressive moments to fill a highlight reel. He was showing sign by sign, story by story, encounter by encounter, that the same 2 paths opened up in front of every single person who came near Jesus. You could see the evidence and demand a more comfortable explanation, or you could look where the sign pointed and let it undo you completely. And John, old John, writing for a generation that had never seen the miracles with their own eyes, was making absolutely certain that the same choice landed in the lap of every reader who ever opened his book, including a 71-year-old Bible teacher sitting in a dusty church library in Charleston, South Carolina, with cold coffee, and a journal full of tally marks, and a faith that was about to be rebuilt from the ground up. The following Tuesday, Michael came back. He always came back on Tuesdays. That had been his rhythm for 11 years. But this Tuesday felt different from every other one before it. He walked into that library the way a man walks into a doctor's office when he already knows the diagnosis is going to change his life. Calm on the outside, barely holding together on the inside. He sat down, opened his journal, read the last line he had written the week before. Signs without surrender are just entertainment. He stared at it for a moment. Then he turned to John chapter 8, and everything shifted. Because this is where John stopped building the case quietly and let the courtroom explode. Michael had always read John chapter 8 as a theological chapter. Dense, important. The kind of chapter seminary professors assigned and students highlighted without fully absorbing. He had taught portions of it before: the woman caught in adultery, the light of the world, the argument about Abraham. He had preached pieces of it and moved on. But he had never read it as a single, unbroken, escalating confrontation. He read it that way now. Jesus was in the temple courts. The Pharisees were there. The crowd was there. And Jesus started speaking in a way that was methodical and calm and completely, deliberately provocative. He said, "I am the light of the world." The Pharisees pushed back immediately. They questioned his testimony. They challenged his authority. They were doing what educated, powerful, religiously credentialed men do. When someone threatens the system they've spent their lives building, they demanded credentials and attacked the source. And Jesus didn't flinch. Michael noticed that. He wrote it in the margin. Jesus never once backed down in John 8. Not once. The argument went back and forth, sharp, fast. The kind of exchange that has an edge to it where every sentence lands like a hand on a table. And then Jesus said something that changed the temperature of the entire room. "You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." The crowd bristled. Michael could feel it in the text, the way you can feel a shift in a room even when you're reading about it 2,000 years later. They said, "We are Abraham's descendants and have never been slaves of anyone." And Jesus looked at them and said something they were not ready for. "Everyone who sins is a slave to sin." Michael set his pen down. He felt that sentence the way you feel a cold wind that comes from nowhere. Because Jesus wasn't talking about the Romans. He wasn't talking about political slavery or economic oppression. He was pointing at something interior, something that no amount of heritage or religious pedigree or moral effort could touch. The slavery of the self. The bondage of a life that is curved inward, circling around its own comfort, its own pride, its own version of God. And the only exit from that slavery, Jesus was saying, was truth, not information, not religion, not tradition. Him, Allah. The argument in John 8 kept climbing. Michael read faster now, leaning forward, barely aware that his coffee had gone cold again. The exchange between Jesus and the religious leaders was getting sharper with every exchange. They invoked Abraham. Jesus told them Abraham rejoiced to see his day. They threw logic back at him. "You're not even 50 years old," they said. "How could you have seen Abraham?" And then Jesus said it. 5 words. The most explosive 5 words in the Gospel of John. "Before Abraham was I am." Michael stopped breathing for a second. He had read those words hundreds of times. He had taught them. He had printed them in a church bulletin once, years ago. He knew the theological weight of them. But sitting in that library on a cold Tuesday morning, with 11 years of worn-down chair springs beneath him and a journal full of discoveries, beside him those 5 words landed differently, because this time he understood exactly what the people in that room understood the moment Jesus said it. He reached for his concordance and confirmed what he already knew in his bones. I am. In Greek, ego eimi. The same construction. The same echo. Centuries earlier in the wilderness at a burning bush that burned without consuming anything, God had spoken to a terrified shepherd and said, I am who I am. Tell them I am has sent you. That was the name above all names. The name so holy that Jewish scribes would stop, wash their hands, and use a new pen before they wrote it. The name that defined God's very nature, self-existent, eternal, the one who simply is, while everything else merely becomes. And Jesus stood in the middle of a public courtyard and used that name for himself. Before Abraham was I am, not I was, not I existed before Abraham, not even I am greater than Abraham. I am. Present tense, eternal tense, the tense that has no beginning and no end. Michael wrote in his journal with a hand that wasn't entirely steady. He didn't say it by accident. He said it so they would understand exactly what he meant. And they did understand. That is the part that always gets lost in polite Bible study. They understood so completely that they immediately picked up stones. Michael read that detail slowly. They picked up stones to throw at him. Under Jewish law, there was one crime that required stoning. One: blasphemy, the claiming of divine identity by a human being. That was the charge. That was what the stones meant. They weren't confused about who Jesus was claiming to be. They were enraged by it. And Michael sat back and thought about something that had never fully formed in his mind before, not in 43 years. If Jesus was only a great teacher, the stones made no sense. Great teachers don't get stoned for their moral instruction. Philosophers don't get executed for wisdom. You don't pick up a rock because someone told a beautiful parable. You pick up a rock because someone just claimed to be God, and you have decided they're lying. Gone. Michael turned forward to John chapter 10. More I am statements. More escalation. I am the good shepherd. He read the context. Jesus was distinguishing himself from what he called hired hands people who were in positions of religious leadership but who would abandon the sheep when danger came because the sheep weren't really theirs. And Michael felt a small, uncomfortable thing happen in his chest. He thought about himself, 71 years old, retired from full-time ministry, teaching a Tuesday Bible study to an audience of none in a library where the lamp flickered and no one noticed whether he came or not. Was he a shepherd? Was he still actively, genuinely caring for anyone? Or had he slowly, quietly, without ever making a deliberate decision, drifted into the comfortable category of someone who loved theology more than people? He pushed the thought aside. He kept reading. Jesus said, I lay down my life for the sheep. And then he said something that Michael had to read 3 times to absorb. The reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. Michael put his finger on that sentence. Jesus was not a victim. That hit him harder than he expected, because without realizing it, Michael had carried a version of the crucifixion in his mind for 43 years, where Jesus was ultimately overpowered, where the weight of human hatred and Roman authority crushed him, where despite everything he was taken. But John was dismantling that picture verse by verse. Jesus said it plainly, no one takes my life from me. I lay it down. The cross was not a defeat that God redeemed later. The cross was the plan. The surrender was the authority. And the love was the reason. Michael closed his eyes. He stayed like that for almost a full minute. When he opened them, he turned to John chapter 11. Lazarus. He knew this story better than almost any other in Scripture. He had preached it, as he said, at his own father's funeral. He had stood at gravesides and read these words to families who were barely standing upright from grief. He knew the arc of it by heart, but he read it again. Lazarus was sick. His sisters Mary and Martha sent word to Jesus. And John recorded Jesus' response in a way that Michael had always found strange, even slightly uncomfortable. When he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. He stayed. He waited. Michael had always glossed over that detail, quickly moving toward the miracle, toward the triumph, toward the moment that made everyone feel better. But now he stopped and sat in those 2 days. Because Mary and Martha didn't know the end of the story when they sent that message, they were not waiting with peaceful certainty. They were waiting the way every human being waits when someone they love is dying with desperate hope and the creeping terror that the hope might not be enough. And Jesus waited while he read the answer in verse 4. This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. Michael wrote slowly. He let them go through the worst thing so that they could witness the impossible thing. When Jesus finally arrived, Lazarus had been in the tomb for 4 days. Martha came running, and the first thing she said to Jesus was the thing you say when you are past anger, past calm, past anything except raw truth. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Michael felt the weight of that sentence. He had heard those words before, not in a Bible study, not in a sermon, at a hospital, from his own mouth, from Dorothy's mouth, from the mouths of people he loved who were breaking under the weight of something they couldn't carry. "Lord, if you had been here." The prayer of every human being who has ever stood at a grave and asked where God was. And Jesus didn't defend himself. He didn't explain the timeline. He didn't say, "Trust me, I have a plan." He said something far more personal. "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die." There it was again. The verb, the action. The one who believes. Not the one who understands the theology of resurrection, not the one who recites the creed, the one who believes actively, dynamically, personally, in the one standing right in front of them. And then John recorded the shortest verse in all of Scripture. Jesus wept. 2 words. Michael had known those 2 words since Sunday school, but this time they broke something open in him that had been sealed for years, because Jesus already knew what was about to happen. He already knew he was going to call Lazarus out of that tomb. He already knew that in a matter of minutes, death itself was going to be reversed. And he still wept, not for Lazarus, for them, for the grief that was real even when the miracle was coming, for the pain that deserved to be honored even when the ending was already written. Michael thought about every person he had ever tried to comfort too quickly. Every time he had reached for a Bible verse before he had fully sat with someone in their pain. Every time he had offered answers before the person in front of him needed anything except someone to weep alongside them. Jesus wept first. Then he raised the dead. Michael pressed both hands against the journal and leaned his forehead down until it rested against the back of his hands. He stayed like that for a long time. Because what John had been building sign by sign, chapter by chapter, confrontation by confrontation, was not simply a theological argument about the identity of Jesus. It was a portrait of a God who was not distant or theoretical or locked inside a stained glass window. A God who came close enough to cry. A God who let people suffer long enough to witness something that could not be explained away. A God who said, "I am," in the middle of a courtyard, knowing they would reach for stones, and said it anyway. Because the truth was worth the cost. And the question John was burning into every page, the question Michael felt pressing against his sternum with a weight he hadn't expected on a quiet Tuesday morning, was not whether Jesus had the authority to raise the dead. It was whether you were willing to let him raise you. Michael didn't go home right away that afternoon. He sat in that chair long after the women's Bible study had ended, long after the last car had pulled out of the parking lot, long after the hallway went quiet. The lamp flickered twice. He didn't reach up to adjust it. He just sat with the Gospel of John open in his lap, and the full weight of what he had been reading pressing down on him like something physical. He had been in ministry for over 4 decades. He had counseled people through divorce addiction, the death of children, the slow erosion of faith that happens when life doesn't turn out the way you planned. He had sat with people in their worst moments and tried to point them toward God. But somewhere along the way, and he couldn't tell you exactly when, couldn't point to a Tuesday or a Sunday or a particular sermon where it happened, his faith had become a profession. It had become the thing he did instead of the thing he lived. He knew the words. He knew the Greek. He knew John's Gospel well enough to write curriculum from it. And yet John's Gospel was asking him a question he had never fully answered. Not do you know about Jesus, do you trust him, right now, with the thing that actually scares you? Michael reached for his pen and wrote one line. Knowledge without surrender is just biography. Then he turned to John chapter 13, John, the upper room, the Last Supper. The night before, everything collapsed. Michael had always approached these chapters 13 through 17 as the theological heart of John, the farewell discourse, Jesus preparing his disciples for what was coming. Deep teaching, important doctrine, the kind of material that filled seminary textbooks and systematic theology volumes. But now he read it as something else entirely. He read it as a room full of frightened men who had no idea their world was about to end. John set the scene deliberately. It was just before the Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. John made the timing unmistakable. This was the last night, the last meal, the last chance to say everything that mattered. And what did Jesus do first? He got up from the table. He took off his outer garment. He wrapped a towel around his waist. He poured water into a basin, and he started washing his disciples' feet. Michael stared at the text, the Son of God, the one who had just said before Abraham was I am, the one who had called Lazarus out of the grave 4 days dead, the one whom John had identified in chapter 1 as the eternal Word, through whom everything that exists was made, was on his knees washing road dust off the feet of 12 men, one of whom was already planning to hand him over to be executed before morning. Peter's reaction was immediate and completely human. Lord, are you going to wash my feet? The question wasn't theological. It was the reaction of a man who was genuinely shocked, embarrassed, maybe even a little horrified. This was wrong. This was backwards. This violated everything Peter understood about how the world was supposed to work, about who served whom, about the natural order of things. Jesus looked at him and said, "You do not realize now what I am doing, but later you will understand." Peter pushed back. "No, you shall never wash my feet." And Jesus said something that stopped him cold. "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." Michael felt the sharpness of that exchange in his chest, because Peter's resistance wasn't stubbornness. It was reverence. It was the deeply human instinct to say, I am not worthy of this. I cannot let you lower yourself for me. My dignity requires that I refuse your grace so that yours remains intact. And Jesus told him that was exactly the wrong instinct. Unless I wash you, unless you let me do the thing that seems backwards and humiliating and wrong, unless you stop insisting on the version of grace that feels comfortable and accept the one I'm actually offering, you have no part with me. Michael wrote in his journal, Peter wanted a Jesus he could serve. Jesus wanted a Peter he could save. He kept reading. Fast now. The pace of the upper room was urgent, and Michael felt it. Jesus finished washing their feet. He sat back down and said, "Do you understand what I have done for you?" He didn't wait for an answer. He told them, "I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you." Then he said something that landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water. "One of you is going to betray me." The disciples looked at each other. John recorded their immediate identical reaction. They were at a loss, confused, troubled. They started asking one by one, "Surely not I, Lord." Michael paused on that detail. "Surely not I." 11 of the 12 asked that question in complete sincerity. 11 men who genuinely could not imagine themselves being the one to break, who saw themselves as loyal, committed, chosen. And yet, before morning, before the rooster crowed, twice Peter would deny Jesus 3 times. The others would scatter. Only John would stand at the cross. "Surely not I." Michael thought about how many times in his own life he had said that, how many times he had assumed his loyalty was secure, his faith was solid, his commitment was unshakable. How many times the thing he was most certain about had turned out to be exactly the thing he was wrong about. He turned the page. John chapter 14. "Do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me." The first word of comfort Jesus offered in the upper room, and Michael noticed again that it was a verb. Believe, not feel better, not calm down, not wait and see. The command was to do the active, intentional, weight-bearing thing of directing trust toward a specific person, even when everything around you was unraveling. Thomas spoke up. Honest, straightforward Thomas, who never pretended to understand something he didn't. "Lord, we don't know where you are going, so how can we know the way?" And Jesus said, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." Michael had quoted that verse 10,000 times. He had it on a plaque in his office at home. He had given it as a memory verse to children in Sunday school. He had defended it in theological debates with people who found it exclusionary and difficult. But tonight in this library, after everything the last 3 weeks of John's Gospel had built that sentence, wasn't a doctrine to defend. It was an invitation from a man who knew he was going to die in the morning. The way, the truth, the life. Not one path among many, not a preference or a perspective. The singular, irreducible, unalterable reality of how human beings get from where they are to where God is. And he said it to 12 terrified men in a borrowed room on the last night of his life. Michael exhaled slowly. Philip pushed further. "Lord, show us the Father, and that will be enough for us." And Jesus. And this is the moment Michael circled, underlined, and wrote 3 stars. Beside Jesus said, "Don't you know me?" Philip, even after I have been with you such a long time, anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. The exhaustion in that response was real. Michael felt it. 3 years. Every miracle witnessed, every sign, every I am statement, every confrontation in the temple, every moment of walking on water, feeding thousands, raising the dead. And Philip still needed to see the Father, because seeing is not the same as believing, and knowing about is not the same as knowing. Michael turned ahead. John chapter 17. Jesus prayed, not for himself first. He prayed for his disciples. Then he prayed for every person who would ever come to believe through their testimony. Every generation, every century, every person who would ever sit in a dusty church library on a Tuesday afternoon and count the word believe 98 times and feel something crack open inside them that they hadn't known was sealed. My prayer is not for them alone. I pray also for those who will believe in me through their message. Michael's breath caught. He read it again. Those who will believe in me through their message. He was in that prayer, not metaphorically, not poetically, literally. On the night before he died, Jesus had prayed for Michael Anderson, had prayed for every person who would ever read John's Gospel and face the same choice that every person in the Gospel faced. Michael pressed his finger against the page. He stayed there. Then he turned to John chapter 18, the garden, the arrest, the moment the disciples scattered. And Michael noticed something he had never paid attention to before. When the soldiers came to arrest Jesus in the garden, Jesus stepped forward and asked them who they were looking for. They said, Jesus of Nazareth. And he said, I am he. Ego eimi. Again. Even now. Even here in the dark, surrounded by soldiers with torches and weapons. John recorded that when Jesus said those words, the soldiers drew back and fell to the ground. Michael read that 3 times. They fell. Before a single sword was drawn, before any violence, before the arrest even happened. At the sound of those 2 words from the mouth of Jesus, they fell. He was not taken. He stepped forward. He was not overpowered. He surrendered on his own terms. And he did it because of the prayer he had just prayed in John 17. Because of the people who would believe. Because the plan required the cross. And the cross required surrender. And the surrender was the most powerful thing that happened in the entire gospel. Michael wrote in his journal, he fell to no one. He gave himself to everyone. He turned to John 19, the crucifixion. He read it slowly, not the way he had read it 100 times before moving through familiar territory. He read it the way a man reads a letter that was written specifically for him. And he found what John wanted every reader to find. At the cross, there were soldiers, there were religious leaders, there was a crowd. There were people who mocked and people who watched and people who gambled for his clothing at the foot of the cross. And there was John, just John, standing there, not running, not hiding, not pretending he didn't know the man on the cross. And Jesus looked down from the cross in pain that Michael could not begin to calculate, and he saw his mother standing there, and he saw John beside her. And he said to his mother, Woman, here is your son. And to John, Here is your mother. In the middle of his own death, he was making sure someone was cared for. Michael thought about that for a long time. Because that is who John watched die. That is who John had followed for 3 years. That is the person whose feet he had seen walk on water, whose voice he had heard call Lazarus out of the ground, whose hands he had seen break bread for 5,000 people. And now those same hands were nailed to wood, and from that wood, with everything he had left, he was still taking care of someone. After this, Jesus, knowing that all things had already been accomplished, not surrendering to the end, knowing that all things were accomplished, He bowed his head, and he gave up his spirit. Michael sat in the silence of the library for a long time after he read that. The lamp flickered. The parking lot outside had gone completely dark. He hadn't noticed the evening coming. He thought about 98 uses of the word believe. He thought about 7 signs that escalated toward the impossible. He thought about 7 I am statements that kept driving toward a single volcanic claim. He thought about the foot washing the upper room prayer, the garden where soldiers fell at 2 words, the cross where the last act was an act of care. And he thought about himself, 71 years old, a Bible teacher, a man who had carried the words of this gospel for 4 decades. And he asked himself one more time the question that John had been building toward all along. Not do you know about him, not do you own a faith, not do you have the right theology. Do you trust him right now, completely, with the thing you've been holding back? Michael Anderson closed his journal. He folded his hands on top of it, and for the first time in a very long time, he didn't reach for words. He just believed. He drove home differently that night, not faster, not slower, but differently. The way a man drives when something inside him has shifted and he hasn't fully found the words for it yet, but he knows with the kind of certainty that doesn't need words that he is not the same person who drove to that library that morning. Dorothy was awake when he walked in. She was sitting in her reading chair, the one with the cross-stitched pillow that said, "In the beginning was the Word," and she looked up at him the way a wife of 47 years looks at her husband when she knows something happened, but she's waiting for him to find his way to it. She said, "You look different." He sat down across from her. He didn't take off his coat, he just sat. "I've been reading John," he said. She smiled. "You've been reading John for 40 years. "I know." He looked at his hands. "I don't think I was actually reading it." Dorothy set her book down. She recognized that tone. She had heard it twice before, in their marriage once, when he felt called to ministry, once when their son had nearly died in a car accident, and Michael had spent 3 days by his hospital bed wrestling with a God he thought he knew and discovering one he didn't. That tone meant something real was happening, something that didn't need to be hurried. She said, "Tell me," and he did. He told her about the tally marks, about 98, about the noun that was never there, about pisteuo, the verb that refused to sit still, about the 7 signs that escalated until there was no comfortable explanation left, about the blind man who said I was blind, but now I see, and was thrown out for the honesty of it, about the I am statements and the stones the crowd reached for when they understood exactly what he was claiming, about Lazarus 4 days dead, and Jesus weeping before the miracle, because the grief was real even when he already knew the ending. He talked for almost an hour. Dorothy didn't interrupt once. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said something he didn't expect. "I've been waiting for you to find that." He looked up. "What do you mean?" She folded her hands in her lap. "Michael, you've been teaching the Gospel of John for decades, but for the last few years," she paused, choosing the words carefully the way she always did when something mattered, "you've been teaching about it, not from inside it." He opened his mouth, closed it again, because she was right, and he knew she was right. And the fact that she had seen it and waited patiently for him to see it himself was one of the most gracious things anyone had ever done for him. He reached across and took her hand. "I need to finish reading it," he said. She nodded. "Then go finish it." Son, he was back in the library the next morning. Not Tuesday, Wednesday. He had never come on a Wednesday before, but he couldn't wait 7 days. Something had been opened and it needed to be completed. He turned to John chapter 20, the resurrection. He had preached Easter sermons for 38 years. He knew this chapter the way musicians know scales automatically, from muscle memory, from repetition so deep it had become unconscious. He had read it at sunrise services with dew on the grass, and at midnight services with candlelight, and at small, struggling churches with 12 people in the pews, and at large, full sanctuaries, where the music swelled and the crowd stood, and the moment felt transcendent. He read it now in a flickering church library alone, and it was better than all of those times combined. Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early while it was still dark. She found the stone rolled away. She ran and told Peter and John. They ran back. Peter went in first. John followed. They saw the burial cloths lying there folded empty, and then John wrote a single sentence about himself that stopped Michael completely. He saw and believed. 3 words. No explanation, no theological commentary, no defense of the resurrection. Just he saw and he believed. Michael thought about what John saw. Not Jesus, not the risen Christ walking and talking and showing his hands. John saw an empty tomb and folded linen. He saw the absence of a body. He saw evidence that something had happened without seeing the thing that happened. And he believed. Michael wrote slowly in his journal, "Faith is not always seeing the miracle. Sometimes it's standing in the empty place where the miracle already happened and trusting what it means." Then he kept reading. Peter and John left, but Mary stayed. She stayed outside the tomb, weeping. And in her grief, in that raw, unguarded moment of a woman who had loved Jesus and watched him die and come to finish preparing a body that wasn't there anymore, 2 angels appeared and asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" She said, "They have taken my Lord away, and I don't know where they have put him." Then she turned and saw someone standing there. She thought he was the gardener. Michael felt the tenderness of that detail, the risen Christ standing in front of her, and she couldn't see him through her tears. She was so deep in grief that she was looking right at the answer to every question her heart was carrying, and she didn't recognize him. The man said, "Woman, why are you crying? Who is it you are looking for?" She said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." And then the man said one word, "Mary," and she knew. Michael pressed his finger against the page, not because of a theological argument, not because of physical proof, not because someone walked her through the evidence systematically and gave her time to evaluate. He said her name, and she knew. Michael thought about John chapter 10. The Good Shepherd calls his own sheep by name. He had read those words 100 times, but he had never felt them the way he felt them now reading about a grieving woman in a garden who turned around because someone said her name the way only one person in the entire world ever said it. She said, "Rabboni," teacher. She reached for him, and Jesus said, Do not hold on to me." Michael had always found that moment strange, almost cold. She had just recognized the risen Christ, and he told her not to hold on. Why? But now he understood. Because the version of Jesus that Mary had been grieving the physical present, walking beside her version that chapter was ending. He was ascending. What was coming next was not Jesus confined to one body in one location in first-century Palestine. What was coming next was the Spirit, the presence that could be with every person, in every place, in every century, simultaneously. He was not pulling away from her. He was expanding beyond what her hands could hold. Michael wrote, "She wanted to keep what she had." He was offering something larger than she could imagine. He turned the pages faster now. John chapter 20, verses 19 through 23. The disciples locked behind closed doors, terrified, certain that what had happened to Jesus was about to happen to them. And Jesus came and stood among them, not knocked on the door, not called out from the street, stood among them. And the first thing he said was, "Peace be with you." Michael read that and felt something release in his chest that he hadn't known was clenched. Peace be with you. To men who had abandoned him, who had hidden, who had made promises they couldn't keep and run when the moment required them to stand. To men who had every reason to expect anger or disappointment or a detailed accounting of their failures. Peace be with you. Then he showed them his hands and his side. And John recorded, "The disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord, but Thomas wasn't there. And when they told him, Thomas said the thing that every honest doubter has said in every generation since. Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." Michael had heard Thomas criticized for that statement his whole life. Doubting Thomas. As if the doubt was the problem. As if the man was uniquely faithless or weak or spiritually deficient. But reading it now, Michael thought Thomas was just honest. Thomas said out loud what the others probably felt and didn't voice. He wasn't asking for something unreasonable. He was asking for what the others had already received. He was asking to see. And a week later, Jesus came back, specifically for Thomas. He didn't send a message. He didn't have someone else explain the evidence. He walked back into that room, stood in front of Thomas and said, "Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." And Thomas did not reach out his hand. He didn't need to. He just looked. And what came out of him was not a careful theological conclusion. It was the most complete, most compressed declaration of faith in the entire gospel. "My Lord and my God." 8 words. Not "I accept the evidence," not "I acknowledge the theological implications," not even "I believe." Just "my Lord, my God," the possessive, personal, irreversible. Michael sat with those 8 words for a long time. Then Jesus said something that reached past Thomas, past the room, past the first century, past every generation between then and now, and landed directly in a church library in Charleston, South Carolina, on a Wednesday morning. "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen, and yet have believed." Michael looked up from the page. He had never seen Jesus. He had never touched the nail marks. He had never stood in a garden and heard his name spoken by a voice that had already defeated death. He had a library, a flickering lamp, a worn concordance, 98 tally marks, and a journal full of questions that had slowly, over 3 weeks, become answers. And Jesus had just called him blessed. Jacques. He turned to the last chapter. John 21. Peter. Peter, who had denied Jesus 3 times before the rooster crowed. Peter, who had stood by a fire in the high priest's courtyard and looked a servant girl in the eye and said, "I don't know him," 3 times. The 3rd time, with an oath. The risen Jesus found Peter the way he always found people in this gospel, by going to them, not waiting for them to get themselves together and come back. Going to them. They were fishing. They had caught nothing all night. A figure on the shore told them to throw the net on the other side. They did. The net filled with 153 fish. And John said to Peter, "It is the Lord." And Peter, impulsive, emotional, magnificent, Peter jumped into the water. He didn't wait for the boat. He didn't compose himself. He jumped. Michael laughed out loud. It surprised him. The sound of it alone in that library on a Wednesday morning. He laughed because that was the most human thing in the entire gospel. The man who had the most to be ashamed of was also the first one in the water. When they got to shore, Jesus had bread and fish cooking over a charcoal fire, and Michael noticed the detail. Charcoal fire. The same phrase John had used for the fire in the high priest's courtyard where Peter had denied Jesus 3 times. John was not careless with his words. He never had been. The charcoal fire was not a coincidence. Jesus was bringing Peter back to the place of his failure, not to punish him, to restore him. 3 times Jesus asked Peter, "Do you love me?" 3 times. Once for every denial. And 3 times Peter answered yes. And 3 times Jesus said, "Feed my sheep." Michael closed his eyes. He thought about himself, about the years of comfortable knowledge, about the faith that had slowly, without a dramatic falling away, settled into something more like ownership than action, about the Tuesday afternoons in a library where he was teaching no one shepherding, no one feeding no one. Jesus hadn't asked Peter if he had recovered his confidence, hadn't asked if he had processed his shame, hadn't asked for a theological statement of renewed commitment. He asked, "Do you love me?" And then he told him what to do with the answer. Feed my sheep. Love is not a feeling that lives in your chest. Love in John's gospel is always a verb. It moves. It costs something. It goes toward people. It gets in the water before the boat reaches shore. Michael opened his journal to a clean page, his last clean page. He had nearly filled the whole thing over 3 weeks. He wrote John's final message, the last line John offered before he set down his pen. Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written. Michael stared at that sentence. John was saying this is not the whole story. This is the beginning of the story. The story continues in every person who reads these words and faces the choice that every person in this gospel faced. The story continues in every person who, like Mary, is so deep in grief they can't see the answer standing right in front of them until it says their name. The story continues in every person who, like Thomas, needs to be honest about doubt long enough to stand in the room where Jesus shows up specifically for them. The story continues in every person who, like Peter, jumps into the water before they've sorted out their shame, because the Lord is on the shore, and no amount of failure is bigger than that fact. Michael Anderson closed his journal. He sat quietly in that library for a few minutes, just breathing, just present. Then he did something he hadn't planned. He picked up his phone and called a former student of his, a man named David, who had stopped coming to church 3 years ago after his wife left him, and his faith had quietly collapsed under the weight of a pain he couldn't make theological sense of. Michael had called him twice in 3 years, left voicemails, received nothing back. The phone rang 4 times. Then, hello. David. Michael's voice was steady. It's Michael Anderson. I'm not calling to check on you or give you a Bible verse. I'm calling because I've been reading the Gospel of John, and I found something I should have told you a long time ago. Can you give me 10 minutes? A pause. Then, yeah. Okay. Michael leaned forward, and he started talking. Not about theology, not about doctrine, about a word that appears 98 times in one gospel, about a man on his knees washing feet the night before he died, about a woman in a garden who couldn't see through her tears until someone said her name, about a man who jumped into the water before the boat reached shore, about a faith that was never meant to be something you own, about a faith that moves. Because John had written his gospel for exactly this moment, for exactly this person, for every person in every generation who was carrying something too heavy and needed to be reminded that Jesus did not wait in the temple for people to get themselves together. He went to them. He goes to them. He is going to them still. And the question that John burned into every page of his gospel, the question that outlasted Jerusalem and the Roman Empire, and every century since, is the same question that lands in your lap right now, wherever you are, whatever you are carrying, however long it has been. Not do you know about him, not do you own the right beliefs, not have you said the right words. Do you trust him right now with the thing that is actually breaking you? Because that is what pisteuo means. That is what it has always meant. And John wrote 98 times so that no one, not one single reader in 2,000 years of readers could miss it. The Word became flesh. He came close enough to cry. He spoke loud enough to wake the dead. He surrendered willingly enough to defeat death itself. He came back specifically for the doubters and the deniers and the ones still weeping in the garden. And he is still speaking. The only question that has ever mattered in the Gospel of John is whether you are listening.